Welcome back to Horrifying Stories. In 1955, 11 boys insisted on climbing up Mount Temple in Banff National Park, west of Calgary, Canada. Their instructor, Bill Oeser, had just called off the team's attempt to hike up the summit of Mount Temple. However, for the 11 boys who found it such a waste not to finish what they had started, there was no turning back. They were doing great with their climb, but little did they know, the summer sun was melting chunks of snow on top of them, and before the kids knew it, an avalanche was rolling fast in their direction. This is their horrifying story. Viewer discretion is advised. Bill Kershaw was a teacher at Chestnut Hill Academy, one of the most prestigious schools in Philadelphia, where kids from some of the wealthiest families attend school. He was 32 at that time. Aside from being a teacher, Bill was also a founder of Wilderness Travel, which has already been around for 9 years. Bill came from a reputable family, his grandfather being a respectable headmaster at Germantown Academy. Thus, it did not come as a surprise when parents of equally reputable families would entrust their children to a 6.5-week summer trip organized by Bill and his business partner, 29-year-old Don Dickerson. The two had arranged a tour across the United States and a portion of West Canada, making several stops in a few of the national parks along the way to camp, hike, and canoe. All these adventures for a hefty sum equivalent to $2,500 in today's rate. It was toward the end of June 1955 when the Wilderness Travel Camp started their adventure in the parking lot of Chestnut Hill Academy, where two vehicles were waiting for its excited passengers. It was a new Ford station wagon and a hearse that has been repurposed into a minibus. Attached to the two vehicles were trailers loaded with camping gears and equipment necessary for the 6.5-week adventure. Joining the trip were 22 boys all in all, the youngest being 12 years old and the oldest being 16 years of age. Bill Kershaw did not join the group as he had another tour group to accompany to New England. It was Bill Oeser, a 28-year-old teacher at Baltimore Junior High, that joined Don Dickerson as camp counselors, bringing them to a total of 24 in the group. One by one, the kids arrived and gathered at the parking lot, ecstatic of the trip they've been daydreaming of for days. The eldest in the group of 22 boys were Tony Woodfield and Billy Watts Jr. Tony was a handsome 16-year-old sophomore whose body was slim and tall. He spent most of his childhood in Switzerland and had frequent hiking experiences in the Alps. Billy Watts Jr., on the other hand, was a blond little man who had undeniable charisma just like his dad. He had just moved from Chestnut Hill Academy and is now a 16-year-old junior in a school in Connecticut. So basically, joining the trip was somewhat like a reunion with his longtime friends in Philadelphia. Not only were the two the eldest in the group, but leadership qualities also came naturally for both Tony and Billy, so they were designated as group's crew chiefs. This made them all the more pumped up for the trip. From Philadelphia, they traveled towards the west, and the first stop of their itinerary was the Mississippi River in Minnesota. The boys had nothing but pure fun swimming in the headwaters of Mississippi River, but the trip did not come without any setbacks. Upon reaching North Dakota, the hearse encountered a bit of technical problem, so they had an unexpected stop at the city of Minot, North Dakota. Thankfully for the trip's organizers, their boys were up for spontaneous adventures. They happily set up camp in one of the town parks there and enjoyed every bit of their 5-day detour. After the hearse was repaired, they were back on the road onto Montana. The second stop of the Wilderness Travel Camp was Glacier National Park. They witnessed for themselves the glittery white snow beautifully covering the tip of the mountains, and the view was breathtaking. It took the group 2 weeks to explore western United States. Then, on July 7, 1955, they finally arrived in Banff National Park, this year's trip highlight. Situated in Canada west of Calgary was this majestic park surrounded by mountains with glacier summits, vast and serene lakes in beautiful shades of blue. The group first set up camp near Two Jack Lake that Thursday afternoon. In his excitement and awe, Billy penned a note for his younger sister who was still 8 years old then, sharing his wonderful experience and the places he got to explore in the past couple of weeks. Part of the planned itinerary was for the group to hike up Mount Temple summit together, then explore another national park in Canada before heading home to Philadelphia by August. So as soon as the group got settled down in their camp, Don Dickerson immediately went to the park information offices to get some maps and inquire about the plan to conquer Mount Temple summit. However, upon reaching the office, he was advised that he needed to accomplish a form should they want to push through with their hike up Mount Temple. Park staff had asked for the schedule of their hike to the mountain's peak, but at that time, Don had yet to decide on the date, especially since he hasn't been able to speak with an expert about Mount Temple yet. So he just went back to the camp without leaving any word to the park staff. 2 days later, on July 9, 1955, Don Dickerson and Bill Oeser decided to try hiking up Mount Rundle, a 9,675-foot mountain located nearby. It was a bit smaller compared to Mount Temple, which had a height of 11,626 feet, so the two camp counselors felt it was somehow a warm-up to their ultimate hiking adventure. Needless to say, the group had a great climb and arrived back at camp at 10 o'clock that Saturday evening. The next morning, they transferred to Moraine Lake and set up their tents near the shore of the majestic turquoise blue lake. The lake was just at the foot of Mount Temple, so this brought them closer to their goal. Now, there was this famous method of hiking up Mount Temple called the scramble, where hikers can climb the southern face of the mountain without necessarily bringing all the hiking gears used in technical climbing. Doing the scramble would mean hikers needed to do rock climbing for a portion of the journey, and guides would sometimes attach ropes as safety harness for the hikers. Experienced guides would also discourage hiking at Mount Temple during those months, since the heat of the summer sun posed a great risk for avalanches of melted snowcaps. Despite being not able to consult with Mount Temple's experienced park guides yet, Dickerson and Oeser decided to push through with the hike the following morning. On Monday, 11th of July 1955, a total of 16 boys started trekking up to the summit of Mount Temple at 9:30 in the morning, a bit later than the usual call time of hikers in the area. 6 boys, along with Dickerson, who was still exhausted from their previous climb, opted to stay at the camp to do laundry. Unaware of the dangers of the climb, Oeser led the boys in their hike up. Compared to Dickerson, Oeser was the less experienced climber, and the 16 boys were not even well prepared for the hike. Some of the boys wore baseball shoes and track shoes instead of hiking boots, and they were only wearing their summer shirts during the hike. All they had was 2 ropes, 150 feet long, and a piece of ice axe, which was assigned to Tony, being the most experienced hiker in the group. Midday was approaching, and Oeser, together with the 16 boys, had been trekking for more than 4 hours when they reached the Sentinel Pass, which was in between Pinnacle Mountain that stood 10,062 feet above sea level and the taller Mount Temple. The boys were now about to climb Mount Temple's southern face. At this point, Oeser was starting to feel a little bit of pain in his foot but continued on with the hike. Upon reaching the 8,500 mark, the boys came across a meadow filled with colorful wildflowers. They paused to rest for a while, and it was then that Oeser decided to call off the hike. He could no longer bear the pain because of the blister on his foot, so he told the boys they should all go back to the camp instead. However, the boys felt it was such a waste to stop at this point. With 8,500 feet already below them, and a few thousand more to go up, there was no turning back for the boys. They insisted and argued with Oeser to have them continue the journey themselves. Oeser gave in to their request and put Tony and Billy in charge of the whole group. After covering a few hundred feet, 5 more boys opted out of the hike and decided to descend. On their way down, they caught up with Oeser, who was slowly making his way back to camp, struggling from discomfort the blisters brought. Unfazed and still up for the challenge were the 11 boys that pressed on with the hike. Aside from Tony and Billy, the last 11 boys standing were 12-year-old Miles Marble, 13-year-old twin brothers Ricky and Tony Ballis, Frederick Ballard, Luther Buzzy Seddon, and Peter Smith, 14-year-old Terry Clattenburg, and 15-year-olds David Chapin and Willie Wise. It was scorching hot that afternoon, so much that the heat slowed the boys down, but the kids appreciated the heat as their clothing wasn't built for chilly weather. Little did they know, that exact same heat of the summer sun they were thankful for would also put their lives in serious danger. Standing on Mount Temple's snowy caps, they could hear sounds of avalanches of snow rolling down the mountains around them. From where they were, they themselves experienced how a little bit of sharp movement would cause small portions of snow to roll in rapid motion. The boys were beginning to worry and become uneasy, so the crew chiefs, Tony and Billy, decided the summit wasn't worth the risk. They took a quick 15-minute rest before starting to descend from 10,000 feet. To ensure the group was intact as they descended, they took the rope they brought along and wrapped it around each of their waists. On both ends of the rope were the crew chiefs. Tony was the last person at the highest part of the mountain, while Billy was the first one leading the team downhill. For every 5 feet of rope, there was a boy tied to the rope through a slip knot, something that expert mountaineers found to have been careless since slip knots have the tendency to choke a person. One thing led to another. Probably thinking it was a much faster route downhill, the boys decided to go across the snowfield and down through the ravine instead of following the ridgelines where there was a lesser risk of avalanches. Slowly but surely, the 11 boys moved in a slow yet steady manner, being careful not to cause sharp movements that could trigger snow to roll down. However, at 4 in the afternoon, as they covered around half the distance going back to the meadow where they parted ways with Oeser, the afternoon sun had melted a large chunk of snow 700 feet above where they were. In a matter of seconds, the chunk of snow began rolling fast and accumulating more snow as it went rapidly downhill along the path where the kids were. Tony had already yelled to the rest of the team that an avalanche was coming and that the kids should take cover. Tony's quick thinking and presence of mind made him strike his ice axe into the ice at the last minute. The next thing he knew, the avalanche hit him. He could feel the rope tighten before breaking him free, and all he did was maintain his grip onto the ice axe. In the blink of an eye, the rest of the 10 boys below him, including the Ballis twins who were right after him on the rope, went on a free fall. Some of them were freed from the rope, while others got caught up in the rope along with the rest. The avalanche continued to blaze through the steep ravine of Mount Temple for almost 2 minutes. From above, Tony could hear the sound of rolling snow and screams of his friends. Realizing he was unharmed, Tony quickly moved along the ridgeline to search for his 10 other friends who got swept by the avalanche. The first one he saw was Frederick Ballard sitting down on a rock, unable to speak and had a cut 6 inches long on his forehead. Without hesitation, Tony tore a part of his shirt and gave it to Frederick. Not far down was Willie Wise. He had cuts on his face, his left wrist and right hip were broken. Tony reached for his backpack and got another shirt, which he struggled to put on Willie to keep him warm. A few moments later, he heard another small yet steady voice crying for help. He started digging fast from the pile of snow where the voice was coming from. After taking away a foot of snow from the pile, it was then that he found his buddy, Billy Watts. He kept digging faster and faster, hoping to free Billy's body from the snow, but he could only dig until Billy's hips. Snow had already frozen, leaving Billy's left leg and right arm stuck. The sun was starting to set and temperatures have now started to drop along with a little bit of hail. Billy was getting cold. With all the energy he had left, he held Billy's chest and tried pulling him up from the pile of snow, but his efforts were simply not enough. Then, out of nowhere, Tony heard another voice. He tried to search for the voice, and it seemed to be coming from the pile of snow close by. Confused and disheartened, Tony thought it through. The freezing cold was already getting into him, and not much of his energy was left. He could only do so much. So with a heavy heart, Tony decided to focus his efforts on Billy Watts first. He went back to Billy's side and kept reminding him to fight for his dear life. Meanwhile, down the rope line just above Billy was Peter Smith. The moment he heard Tony scream of the coming avalanche, he immediately secured his head and grabbed onto a rock. But as soon as the ball of snow hit him, he lost his grip and he got swung across the mountain with the rope almost choking him. He tried to unleash himself from the rope and successfully did so, but another ball of snow hit him, dropping him another 100 feet below. Standing up, he saw bodies everywhere. At first, he tried to help them, but he soon realized that he was better off going back to camp as quickly as possible to get the rescue that everyone needed at that point. Along the way, the bruised and bleeding Peter came across Bill Oeser, who ran up as soon as he heard the boy's screams. Peter recounted what they had experienced above, and Oeser immediately told him to continue running down as fast as he could for help. By the time Oeser arrived at the scene, he saw Buzzy Seddon and Terry Clattenburg securely bound together. Buzzy's left leg got broken and had a number of bruises, while Terry's skull had 3 fractures. His face had many cuts dripping with blood, and has suffered a frostbite in his right foot. Oeser then freed Buzzy and Terry from the rope that bound them together, as well as the rope binding the Ballis twins nearby. After freeing them, he immediately realized that one of the twins had already froze to death in the snow. As he went further, he saw Tony still trying to pull Billy up and tried to help him, but tragically, Billy had also frozen to death with his neck broken. Around that time, Peter Smith had already arrived back at camp and reported everything that happened to Dickerson. Right then and there, Dickerson started going up to where the kids were. As he was climbing, he came across Tony, who was now heading down, exhausted and freezing. Tony told him around 3 or 4 boys were either dead or dying, and that he still hasn't seen Dave Chapin. It took him roughly 3 hours trying to pull Billy out, but his leg was simply stuck under the pile of hardened snow. After Peter reported the incident to the park officials, staff and volunteers teamed up and started hiking up Mount Temple. Peter, even with all his cuts and bruises, guided them to where his friends were in the middle of the night. Leading the rescue team was Walter Perrin, and with him in the team of rescuers was a resident doctor from the nearby hotel, along with some of the hotel staffs. Perrin had just recently joined the park's team as its mountain rescue expert, which the park thought it needed after 4 women had died the previous year falling 1,500 feet from one of the mountains. Having come from Switzerland, Perrin was used to climbing and moving swiftly in high altitudes. At around 11 in the evening, the first team of rescuers reached the scene. The resident doctor from the nearby hotel, Dr. Jeffrey Sutton, first responded to the remaining Ballis twin brother. But sadly, as soon as he was transferred to the stretcher, the boy breathed his last. This brought the death count to 5: Billy Watts, Willie Wise, Buzzy Seddon, and the Ballis twins. David Chapin and Miles Marble were still nowhere to be found during that point. Dr. Sutton then focused his attention on the surviving boy, Terry Clattenburg. After giving him morphine, Perrin and his team placed Terry on a stretcher and carried him all the way down to the foot of the mountain. Upon bringing Terry to safety, the team just went for a quick break before climbing back up and continuing with the rescue mission. Come noontime the next day, Perrin was able to successfully break the snow that was holding Billy's body. To their surprise, Billy's body was tied down to the bodies of David Chapin and Miles Marble underneath him. Apparently, it was one of their voices that Tony had heard the day prior after having found Billy. Perrin and his team loaded their frozen bodies onto horses to be taken back to the mountain's base. Around the same time, one by one, parents of the boys learned of the tragedy their boys had ended up in. In no time, news of the boys filled headlines, and sorrow and grief filled Philadelphia, especially the Chestnut Hill Academy. Arthur Wise, Willie's father, was very angry and was determined that Bill Kershaw's negligence must pay for what had happened to their son. His wife Eleanor never had the courage to look at their son's dead body, as she did not want to ruin his last memory of Willie. The Wise and Ballis families filed a case against Kershaw. However, Canadian law did not really favor similar lawsuits during that time, and just required Kershaw $7,000 per death as settlement. For the Chapin family though, they'd like to think David died doing what he loved doing. They even arranged for his ashes to be sprinkled as the plane flew above the peak of Mount Temple. When asked for a statement, Kershaw could not believe what had happened, but left the situation to God, acknowledging that things are not within his control. He continued on with the other trip up until the trip's scheduled completion. Dickerson and Oeser, along with the 3 surviving boys, Tony, Peter, and Frederick, had to stay for 4 more days in Canada for a thorough investigation on what had happened. 6 jurors led the investigation on July 15, 1955 in Alberta. Then on August 10, 1955, a total of 9 rescuers and park officials took the witness stand as well. No criminal charges were filed against the Wilderness Travel or its counselors, but the jurors concluded the tragedy was a result of poor planning and preparation, poor judgment, and inexperience. Kershaw continued to arrange travel camps for another 20 years, but in 1977, he was convicted of molesting 2 11-year-old boys in another trip he organized a year prior. He did not talk much about the incident. Kershaw died in 2015. He was 91 years old. Dickerson eventually became one of the most known insurance professionals and professors in Florida. He died in 1974. He was just 48 then. His wife only knew of the tragedy after finding newspaper clippings as she was cleaning up his things after he died. He never talked about it, but she knew he harbored guilt all his life. Oeser gave up being a teacher and pursued his career as an accountant instead. Like Kershaw and Dickerson, his family never heard him talk about the tragedy. Perrin, on the other hand, established a rescue school that trained park rangers on how to move swiftly in high altitudes. Eventually, his method became an international model. Peter Smith graduated from Williams College and joined the Special Forces of the U.S. Army. He became an anti-war advocate after having been deployed to Vietnam and years later decided to become an Amish farmer. Peter lived with depression which his family believed was due to the tragedy many years back. Sadly, he committed suicide in 2013. He was 71 years old then. The three other survivors, Frederick, Tony, and Terry, graduated from Harvard. Frederick and Terry pursued law and became very successful lawyers. Frederick died in 2014. He was 72 years old. After Harvard, Tony proceeded with his studies, getting his master's at Cornell University. He became an aid worker and a UN economist before retiring in Switzerland. In his final months, he got to communicate with the sisters of Billy Watts, who had nothing but gratitude for the efforts in attempting to save their brother. In the end, he got the closure that he ever longed for. He was 71 years of age when he died of colon cancer. Terry is the only living survivor, and for many years has been a lawyer under the Community Legal Services supporting the less privileged. At one point, he went back to Mount Temple with his son Will. The trauma the tragedy brought each of them was unimaginable, but Terry preferred to look back to where it all started, at the meadow filled with wildflowers, where they decided they weren't turning back. Thank you for making it this far. Please subscribe to our channel for more horrifying stories. If you wish to hear more climbing incidents, please click the video on your left. Otherwise, you may check out our other horrifying stories too.